Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for coming out today. We have Councilmember Julie Menin with us. She serves as chair of the Committee on Small Business and was the New York City Census Director before her election to the New York City Council. She previously served as the Commissioner of Consumer Affairs and the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment Commissioner as well under the last administration. Did I get everything?
Yes, and I'm a mom.
And she's a mom.
Most importantly.
Who dropped her first kid off to college just a few days ago.
Yes.
Please welcome Julie Menin. Julie and I actually met because we were running against each other last year, and she bested me, and then she very graciously agreed to be here today to talk about her work on the council. So I'm going to start with something about your first year as a role as an elected official. You've served in government for many, many years, but this is something different. It's the first time the public has sent you to office, and I'm curious, what are you proudest of that you've gotten done in this first year?
Well, thank you, Chris. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And as Chris mentioned, yes, we ran against each other as primary opponents. And I think Chris is testament to the fact that you can run against someone, but yet still build a phenomenally close, really productive relationship. And it's a testament to him. And I know we're going to see a lot more of him. So just wanted to say that. So I love being in the City Council. As Chris mentioned, I've done a lot of work over the years in government. I started my career as a lawyer and then served as commissioner of several city agencies. And really, to answer your question, what am I most proud of in terms of the first year? It's the legislation that I've put forward. So I chair the city's small business committee, and I have a whole host of bills basically that are going to make it easier to own and operate a business. I'll mention just one of them briefly. It's about to be voted on in the next couple weeks, and that is a one-stop shop bill that consolidates every single permit that any small business needs to operate into one website, one application. If you're a small business owner and you're dealing with New York City government, sometimes you have to take several days off of work, literally, to deal with all of the different bureaucracies, all the different city agencies. So this streamlines things, makes it more efficient, makes it easier to own and operate a business. And then secondly, I'd say on the legislative front, the thing that I'm really most proud about is universal child care. So I'm a mother of 4, and one of the things that I really ran on in terms of campaigning was this idea of universal child care. So I have a package of bills, 5 to be specific. They are likely going to hopefully be voted on in the end of September. We're still waiting for the date, but they have a supermajority of support. They have the support of the mayoral administration, and they would create universal child care in New York City. We would be the first city in the country to implement universal child care. It's a game changer because for so many parents, but particularly mothers, they're being pushed out of the workforce because they cannot afford child care.
Thank you for that. And I want to stay on small business for a second. And we're going to do the format a bit differently today. I know we traditionally save questions for the end, but if you have a question while you're speaking, raise your hand and Evan will bring you a microphone so we can add clarifications as we go. So we're trying something new and I'm sure Julie's going to be completely cool with it.
Absolutely.
So sticking with small businesses, the Fed Chair, Jerome Powell, in a speech this week, sort of warned Americans that we're going to experience a bit of tough times ahead because in the effort to combat long-term inflation, we're having to engage in short-term interest rate hikes that could negatively impact employment. And while he didn't say it directly, he seemed to be warning that we're going to see a slight uptick, at least in the unemployment rate. So what can we do here in New York to offset that, especially in communities that are economically struggling?
Well, it's a great question, and unfortunately in New York City, we have seen higher unemployment than some other comparable cities across the country. So we need to do much more to combat that. One of the things that I frankly think the city should be doing is creating a job bank of really available jobs coupled with resumes that the city would maintain on a website so that we really make sure that we're connecting people with available jobs. Because there are jobs that are available, but we're not necessarily connecting people to them. And so that's something that we need to do. But at the end of the day, unemployment's an enormous challenge, but the other challenge is a lack of affordable housing. So for so many people, they've lost their job, they can't afford their rent, and then they end up being evicted, they end up having to leave the city. We are not building enough affordable housing. That problem is probably most serious in communities like this, because the district that I represent, and this is Council District 5, is actually the densest city council district, meaning our sheer density, it creates real problems in terms of finding new available sites to build on. So it makes it even harder than ever to build affordable housing. So this is something I'm really focused on, because yes, we have to obviously focus on unemployment, but we also have to focus on how we're going to build more affordable housing. And that's something there are some development projects that are going to be coming down the pipe in this area, but there are not that many, and not enough that we can really build a significant stock of affordable housing. And so people are being priced out of their home every single day. The average rent in Manhattan is $5,000 a month. It's just not affordable for the vast majority of people.
So speaking a bit about that and density here, what are you working on currently with your colleagues to address that citywide, to address, you mentioned a few projects, is there anything that especially stands out or approaches you want to see taken?
Yes, definitely. So one of the big tensions that we have in the council is going to be around member deference. Member deference is the policy where a city council member, basically there are 51 council members, the other council members defer to that council member on land use projects that are happening in their district. And there's a lot of tension around that, because some people think member deference is great. Council member knows their district better, perhaps, obviously, than other members. But also at the same time, we want to make sure that we're building affordable housing. So there's like always this tension. In the conversations I've had with my colleagues, we're really focused on trying to think outside of the box. The city, under the last administration, had set rather low levels of affordable housing, generally around 25%, that could be built. We want to increase that, because 25% is rather low. And if we're going to be giving extra height, which is oftentimes like how this is done, we should be getting more affordable housing as part of that bargain. So that's what we're going to be looking at.
It's interesting that you brought up member deference, because I know when we were running last year, it was a subject that came up a lot, because there was a lot of change in the thinking around member deference and whether that was the best way to approach these problems. Have you seen a change among the new members and the attitudes towards member deference overall?
I mean, in conversations I've had with some members, they're much more open to thinking outside of the box on that. Traditionally, for many, many years, council members never questioned member deference. Now we're starting to see that change. There was a project in this district when we were both running where the council member was opposed to it. This was the Blood Center project, if you heard about it, that was in the little farther down in the 60s, and the council member opposed the project. Council ended up approving the project. They overrode member deference. So I think there always has to be a balance. There has to be a balance, but we have to build affordable housing. Like we just have to. I mean, we can't just let the city continue to grow at this rate with more and more people being priced out of living in New York City. I mean, I think about this, when my mom came here, my mother and grandmother, Chris knows this story well, came here as Holocaust survivors into this neighborhood. They moved into a rent-controlled apartment. The only reason they were able to afford to live, particularly in this neighborhood, but quite frankly in New York City at all, is because they were able to find a rent-controlled apartment. So we just need to do this, and we're going to need to make some tough choices going ahead.
Bringing up the story of your parents, I actually had a question about that for you, which is you've shared your story frequently about your family surviving the Holocaust and coming to New York. We're starting to see an uptick in anti-Semitic dialogue throughout the U.S. It's coming from large swaths of the American right and some pockets of the American left. Why do you think that's happening, and what can we do about it here in New York City to prevent that from taking further hold?
I mean, it's a great question, and I have to say, and certainly for hate speech coming from the right, I think we have to look back at the presidency of Donald Trump, where somehow it was viewed as okay to say outrageously false, offensive things about other people, other groups, and that was just commonplace. And so I believe, and look, I haven't looked at the data to see the exact link at when the uptick occurred, but what I can tell you from a firsthand standpoint that anti-Semitic incidents in New York City are up over 275%. That is completely unacceptable. And we're seeing swastikas being scratched into Carl Schurz Park right down the street. being spray painted all over this district. It's happening again and again and again. Even in my first 2 weeks in the council in January, there were 2 anti-Semitic incidents in the course of a week. So we have to do more. The NYPD has a hate crimes division, but we need them to really beef up their enforcement and what they're doing. But I would have to say that I do blame the presidency of Donald Trump for basically, particularly on the right, having more hate speech. We saw it, I was the census director, as Chris mentioned, we saw it around the census. We saw around the census some of the worst hate speech around immigrant groups. It is why Donald Trump wanted to put a citizenship question on the census, which would have been a question that hadn't been on the census in 70 years, that would have asked, are you a US citizen? We sued, we went to the Supreme Court, won that case, got the question off. But it's just endemic as to what that administration was about. It was not about inclusivity and tolerance. It was about just the opposite.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned, you say you haven't looked at the data, but what you've observed is consistent with the data, because I was reviewing the data relatively recently, and you start seeing that trend upward around 2017, which tracks the beginning of his administration. We're seeing this sort of anti-Semitism throughout the US, but Donald Trump is likely about to announce a run for the presidency again. Are there actions that you can take at the city level ahead of that to sort of start proactively combating the anti-Semitic narrative and creating a space of welcoming? Because New York is home to so many Jews.
Absolutely, it's such a great question. So I'm a member of the Jewish caucus, and one of the things we are really focused on doing is Holocaust education. I mean, it's incredible to think about, and it just, every time I think about it, it just shocks me. But you have so many young people, particularly in the city, that have not been educated about the Holocaust. They don't know a lot about it, they don't, and this is a problem. So we need to make sure that the Holocaust education is embedded into the curriculum, I believe, and it's something the Jewish Caucus is focused on. But we also need to be working across the city with as many different groups as possible, because this hate speech is not only a problem in the Jewish community, it's a problem in the Asian American community. I mean, you're seeing for so many groups that hate speech is on the rise. And so we need to work, and we're doing this collaboratively together to make sure that we are cracking down on it. And I did a big town hall on anti-Semitism, and I brought in some of the leading experts on how to combat anti-Semitism. And one of the first things they said is, the first thing to do is to call it out, and to call it out loudly, because if you're silent and you don't say anything, it again perpetuates that this is acceptable behavior. So the first thing is obviously to call it out, to condemn it right away. And so we are very focused on that, but we're also focused on the education piece, is making sure that young people in particular have been educated, that it was not that long ago that millions of people, including my grandfather, were killed just because they were born Jewish. So we have to make sure that we're educating people to that fact.
And I think that brings up an important point overall relating to education and crime. You were talking about the uptick in hate crimes, and we've also seen, well, there's a few things going on at the same time. We have an uptick in certain categories of crime, including various violent crimes over last year. We also have some city officials that are using fear-mongering tactics for political gain and overstating cases. So a lot of New Yorkers, they don't feel confident in how safe their city is. They're wondering, what is true, what is not true. How do we address the uptick that we have seen in some crimes over 2021 through policy at the root, and without engaging in any kind of reactionary behavior that actually makes the problem worse?
Well, I think this is very important, because I get asked this question all the time, and to me it's not a question of the reality, the perception. If people don't feel safe, this is a problem. Whether the data bears it out or not, if people don't feel safe and they won't ride the subway, or they don't want to open up a small business because they're concerned about retail theft and public safety, or they feel like they want to move out of the city, this is a problem, and we have to combat that. And so how do we combat that? Well, in a number of different ways. I have been working very collaboratively with the 19th precinct, on some of these issues, because if people don't feel safe, we have to do something about that. Like, one of the things we're doing, and this, I think to me, this is common sense. If you walk on the East River Esplanade, we need more lighting at night. The East River Esplanade, if you call 311 and you're the victim of a crime, you actually can't report the Esplanade because it is not in the 311 system. So it's like things like that that are so common sense that we need to be doing. But we're working really closely with the 19th precinct, again, to try to combat crime immediately. So whether it is, and you know, we're getting a lot of complaints, particularly, and I chair the Small Business Committee, about shoplifting, about retail theft. I mean, I hear from small businesses all across the city every day about that. So it's working with the NYPD to try to crack down on that. Because again, that's a deterrent for small businesses to want to open up a business, and we can't have that. And so we're trying to use all the tools in the toolbox, but at the same time, we're also focused on community-oriented strategies, which are, you know, building better relationships between the community, between the NYPD, investing in social service programs, incredibly important. After-school youth programs, you know, the city made an enormous investment in summer youth and really like increasing that programming. I think that was a very important decision that was made. And so we have to be combating this on using every single one of these tools.
And I think the data bears out that when you address crime at its roots, such as through the youth programs, after-school programs, I mean, a lot of what you see, especially in terms of theft-related crimes, is coming from a combination of economic insecurity and instability in young people's lives. And so that kind of brings us to another subject that was recently in the news, which is the education budget. There's no way to ask this in the most polite way, so I'm just going to say, what in the world happened? Because we had a situation where the council passed a budget and then immediately denounced the very budget that they passed, and it made people wonder, like, what was going on? Did they not read the budget? Like, are we going to be able to fix this? Like,
Sure,
give us the background.
Sure, so what Chris is alluding to, and there was a lot of reports in the press, is in June, the council voted on our budget, passed the budget, and then several weeks later, there was a lot of uproar around school budget cuts. I'm not on the council budget negotiating team, so just to be clear, I was not in the room when this budget is being negotiated. With that said, I absolutely voted for the budget because there were really important wins in the budget, including programming for summer youth, the biggest expansion of summer youth programming ever, enormous wins on affordable housing. There was a lot in that budget that was really, really important. What happened on the school budget cuts is, the speaker is working and negotiating this directly with the mayor to try to get these cuts restored, and they're still working on it. We're seeing cuts in our schools here in this district, which are very concerning because it means that we will lose some teachers, some art teachers, some music teachers. And so, what I can tell you is the speaker is working very hard on trying to get those cuts restored. But the other thing I will say on education that's very important and I'm really proud of is I was able to allocate a little over $5 million to PS 290, which is a school in this district. It's one of 8 schools that did not have a gymnasium, so they had no gym, no area for kids to play other than on the street, closing down a city street, that is not a gymnasium, that is not a play area. So I was able to allocate that, and now we're building a rooftop play space for PS 290, which is a really great win for our community. I was also able to get, and working with the speaker, $3 million for Julia Richmond, which is an educational complex of a number of different schools. So we're building out pool and locker room facilities for them. I was able to make allocations to every single school in this district. All combined, was able to get, with the help of the speaker and the borough president, over $21 million going to this district. It's more than has ever been allocated for this district, so I'm very proud of that.
You ran on a slogan of Menin gets it done, and I don't think there's anybody who would challenge that has been happening. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I also recognize that question was ever so slightly unfair since that is not your committee. And I should point out that I believe you were on a letter calling for restoration of the cuts as well. So credit where credit is due on that. I just hoped you could explain to us what in the world was happening, because a lot of people were reading the news reports and going, we don't understand. And that comes to a larger question about uh, civic engagement, a lot of what happens in city government isn't terribly accessible to people. They wonder, they're not sure about the backroom negotiations that go on. They don't really know how the processes work. But we now have a majority freshman class council, including yourself. Do you think that the city could be doing a better job keeping the public informed about the goings-on of the council? And are there any kind of public education programs or engagement programs to get people more involved with their local offices?
Absolutely. So I implemented participatory budgeting this year, which is a way for the public writ large in our district to make decisions over what they think my office should be spending money on. So we allocated $1 million to that, and that meant the public, you all got to vote on which projects you wanted me to fund. So we did that, and I thought that was really fantastic, and I plan on doing that again, and it's a great way to get involved. I believe that people should be civically involved. It's incredibly important, and there are many, many different ways to do so. I think participatory budgeting is one. The community board is another way. Community board 8, which covers this area. It's possible to be a public member. It's possible to be a full board member. Manhattan Borough President appoints half the members. I appoint the other half. So if that's something of interest, please let me or my office know. I'm always looking for people who want to serve on the community board. I think it's another great way to get involved. But there are always ways to improve civic engagement, transparency, all of that. And I, always open to hear comments on that.
I have to say, on a personal level, I have found you to be among the most accessible elected officials I have ever met, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
In addition to questions around civic engagement, I'm curious, since this is your first time serving in an elected office as opposed to city government, what are some of the challenges that have been unexpected? Things that you weren't expecting to encounter when you went into it, and how have you overcome those challenges?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the things that I really wasn't certain about is I have served in city government for a very long time as an executive, running agencies, which is very much an executive role. You're managing very large teams. That when I was Commissioner of Consumer Affairs, I had about 400 people, 450 who worked at that agency. The legislative role is incredibly different. It's basically working with your colleagues and working with the council drafters to draft legislation. I've been a lawyer for over 20 years. I love practicing law, and so the legislative portion of it is incredibly interesting to me. I actually love the legislative process. I like working with the legislative drafters. I like working with my colleagues, but I wasn't sure what that experience was frankly going to be like, but I love it. And it's different, a legislative role versus an executive role. So that, I think, I've been so pleasantly surprised by how much I've liked the legislative process, and I feel like I'm getting a lot of bills. I've introduced a lot of bills, and I feel like hopefully this month we're going to be voting. We voted my first bill out that actually created an Office of Reproductive and Sexual Health within the Department of Health, basically to help to create abortion access. So that was my first bill, and that was voted on and passed a couple weeks ago. So I like that a lot, and that's probably been, this is a very pleasant surprise. The other thing that's very interesting about being an elected official versus being a commissioner is if you're a commissioner, you are prohibited from political involvement by the city. So a lot of people don't realize that. And in fact, when I ran, some people said, well, wait a minute, you haven't been to the political clubs in this area, and you didn't speak out at the community board about this. And I said, well, actually, because you're not allowed to. The city's conflict of interest board prohibits commissioners from coming into political clubs, from donating to city candidates. And the reason why is because if you're running a city agency, you really need to be working with everyone, Republicans, independents, Democrats, people who aren't politically involved. So they have very strict rules prohibiting you from any political conduct or contact whatsoever. So I've sort of missed that, and now I get to do it, and I'm really excited about doing that. I like going to the political clubs. I like getting involved and supporting other candidates. I didn't do a lot on the endorsement side this time because I'm just really focused on, it's my first year, but I plan on getting more involved in that, and I'm enjoying that.
Thank you, and I'd like to point out I was not one of the candidates who made that specific criticism because I knew about that role and I thought it was a good thing that you observed it. Because if there's one thing that's been a negative from the what we'll call the Trumpism effect is that there's been a breakdown between between branches of government and how they interact with each other. And part of what keeps the society moving functionally is that every portion knows its place and is not creating conflict with other sectors in ways that are ethically dubious. But on the point of that change into a legislative role, have you found it at all a little difficult or startling to be talking about hot button political issues when that was something that you were prohibited from doing previously?
No, not at all, because I have to say I missed it. When I was running at different agencies and couldn't get involved, I'd be yearning to get involved. Oh, I'd like to take a position on that, or I'd love to speak out on that issue, but you couldn't. So you're very much constrained. So it's actually liberating, quite frankly, to be able to do that now. So I love that.
Good, because I'm going to ask you about a hot button political issue. No, it actually is something I texted you about a few weeks ago. So I asked you about the horse carriages in Central Park, which has suddenly become a very big issue. It's been reported on widely in local media. There's been a series of animal abuse documented in Central Park with the horses. There have been organizations that have been fighting to remove the carriages for years. And right now, your colleague Bob Holden has a bill that is co-signed by the majority leader. Do you support the bill, and why or why not?
So Bob Holden is a council member from Queens who's introduced a bill on the horse carriage issue, as Chris has said. I have not signed on to the bill because I'm waiting for the hearing, as when a hearing is scheduled, and that's very commonplace. So council members can either sign on to a bill immediately, which sometimes we do, or oftentimes we wait for a hearing so that we can meet with the various stakeholders. There are a lot of stakeholders involved in this issue. Everyone from, we've got a lot of phenomenal animal rights groups that have worked really, really hard on the issue. We have a number of labor unions that have a stake in this too, and I'm looking for the hearing where I get to be able to talk to everyone about that. And so look forward to when that hearing is scheduled.
When is the hearing scheduled?
They haven't scheduled it yet.
We'll fix that. So I'd like to open, since nobody has raised their hand yet, or is a little shy, I'd like to open this up to questions. Does anybody have a question for Julie? Oh, we have someone already. We've been waiting.
I understood that you were going to discuss an issue that's very important to us here at Inspire, and that's the bike lane opposite our front door that is really hazardous for those of us who want to exit the building and have to go to either corner in order to access cars that are waiting for us. Is there some way that you can alleviate the danger of the bike lane speeding by the front door and preventing us from exiting a car or a taxi opposite the front door of this building?
That is such a good question, and I want to give you a little extra context on this because I was actually going to ask that later in the program. Outside right now, when residents exit, and correct me if I'm wrong, if they'd like to enter a taxi, they have to cross over a bike lane. In addition to that, there's no gradient on the stoop like there are at the edges. It's just a steady drop. So there's two things going on. One is that people on bikes are not aware that there is a senior residence here. So they are speeding by and not paying attention. And there's been a number of near collisions for the residents when they're trying to cross over. Questions there would be related to, are there infrastructure solutions? Can we get special signage? And the other one is, is it possible to do a mid-block gradient ramp the way you have on the edges for wheelchair and walker accessibility?
Okay,
did I get that right?
Can you make some notes on that? Thank
Perfect.
you. Thank you for that context, and I'd be happy to work with the Department of Transportation, which is the one that really works on bike lanes, to see if we can do that. Signage, I think, would be a great idea because it will make everyone more aware of it. There could be infrastructure. We could look at changing the grade to see if that's something that we could do. So I'd be happy to reach out to DOT to see if we can get that addressed.
Thank you. And for the audience, I will be working with you all on this issue, so I'll keep you updated on what's going on.
Fantastic. You have a great advocate. That's great.
Because I absolutely do not want anyone here being injured as they're trying to cross the streets. And it's something that would, be replicable for other senior residences
Yes.
across the city when we find a solution to the problem.
Definitely. I think the gentleman has another question.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand what we can expect and how long it's going to take to get something implemented which presents a hazard every day of the week for us. Is this something that's going to happen in a year? Can it happen sooner? Is there something that can be done immediately to alert bikers
Yeah.
that there are elderly people trying to get into a taxi?
Sure. So you have my assurance that I will reach out personally to the DOT commissioner, who I've worked with for many years, and to see how quickly we can act on this. I did a walkthrough along First Avenue. I was not aware of this issue, or I would have alerted him at that time about it, but I promise you I will get them to focus on it as soon as they possibly can. I will focus on it right away. You've got my commitment, and let me try to pressure them to do something quickly.
Well, we're solving problems right here, right now.
There you go.
Thank you very much for that question. We'll update you on that. Who's next? Don't be shy.
And the other thing is, I want to make sure, do people have voter registration? Because I know for many, I don't know if you're voting if you've changed your voter registration to here, but I do want to mention that. I think that's incredibly important.
That's a very good point because this is a relatively new facility, so a lot of people may be registered elsewhere. If anybody has any voter registration concerns, or they're not sure that they're registered at this residence, let Evan know, and we will correct that
we will
immediately.
bring voter registration forms. Anna will bring them, and that way you can get registered. It's so important, and there are rules around registration of how early you have to register before an election.
Thank you for that. What problem are we solving next? Did you have a question? Saw a hand go up. All righty. So
Or
let's
anything else? Any other issues? No.
Oh, I have plenty
Okay.
for you. I just wanted to make sure we gave everybody a chance. So right now we're headed back into election season. I don't believe you have any opponents whatsoever. But explain to everybody why we have 4-year terms and then a 2-year term, because a lot of
Sure.
people who are registered here are going, I just voted for Julie, why am I voting for her again?
Okay, so the city council's terms are generally 2 4-year terms, and then you are term limited out after 8 years. However, every 10 years, because of the census, we have to do redistricting. So you probably heard about the congressional redistricting. We just had a congressional race based on the redistricting. And now the city council lines are being redrawn. And because it's a redistricting year, my term is only 2 years. So I ran in June of 21. I was elected in the Democratic primary. And now my Democratic primary, again, is going to be June of 23. So I'm running for re-election, and will be on the ballot in June.
And in terms of legislative priorities going forward, we talked a lot about the bills that you've introduced already. What are some long-term goals that you have as a council member, things that can't be solved immediately this year, but that you're working on for the duration?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So I have so many bills that I've introduced. I don't have the final count just in the past couple months. And some of them are longer term because they take longer to do. So for example, I have a bill on the small business front to create an office of digitalization. It's really interesting. When you look at small businesses across the city, many of them don't even have a website. Many of them don't have a delivery operation. And as we saw from COVID, if you don't have a delivery operation, particularly if you're a food business or a retail business, you're missing out on an enormous customer base. So my office, my bill would require that the small business agency, SBS, would create this office that would help small businesses throughout the city set up websites and actually make sure that we're creating a more digital platform. I also have a whole package of bills that I'm going to be introducing in the next 60 days, hopefully, on hospital pricing. Because I am increasingly concerned that many hospitals in the city are gouging people. And if you actually look at the cost of procedures, it's incredible, the discrepancy. Giving birth, for example, in New York City, some hospitals charge women $55,000. Some charge $15,000 to $20,000. It's all over the map, and that's for childbirth. But for so many different procedures, there are enormous costs associated with it, and there's not a lot of transparency. It's not as if you need to get a medical procedure, you're finding out in advance, so wait a minute, this is going to cost X, and these are the associated attendant costs. So I'm looking to do this package of bills that would bring transparency, accountability, and more fair pricing around hospital pricing. So that's like the very important long-term, that's like after universal child care, that is the next big policy issue that I'm going to really turn my attention to.
And talk a little bit about how that's legal in the first place and the mechanism by which you're going to change it, should your bill pass.
Well, it's interesting because I was an adjunct professor at Columbia, and I taught on city government, but I also taught on something called preemption, which is when the state can preempt the city from acting. And so on hospital pricing is a very interesting area because certainly there's federal rules around hospital pricing, but I'm trying to carve out some areas around hospital pricing where the city would have jurisdiction. So that's what we're looking at doing right now, and really creating more transparency about hospital pricing. But it's interesting because, you know, for any of these bills, you're always making sure that there's an avenue for the city. And that's really where I get excited, like trying to creatively look at an issue and say, well, wait a minute, we can't do the bill in this area because we'll be preempted, but we want to have 100% jurisdiction in this one lane if we go forward.
Do you expect a lot of pushback or legal challenges to such action?
Well, we're not there yet. I haven't introduced the bills yet, so we'll see what happens.
I'm sure you'll handle it. So staying on healthcare for a moment, and to let everybody know, we're actually going to be speaking with Mark Levine, Borough President, next month. But right now, how is the council planning to address these sort of coalescing of pandemics, and what we're going to see is an increase in general disease and pandemic due to climate change? So right now we have the COVID-19 pandemic, we have monkeypox, which is on the edge of, or maybe technically counts as a pandemic now, and then we're also finding concerns in the wastewater around things like polio. So what can the council do proactively for public health right now as we're facing these new or re-emerging diseases?
It's a really important question. So a good friend of mine, City Councilwoman Lynn Shulman, chairs the Health Committee, and I've had many conversations with her about this exact question, because it's like it's an onslaught on every single front with things that like if 5 years ago, if you had said to someone, there's going to be a global pandemic, not only in New York City, but across the world, that is literally going to shut down cities across the world, people would have said, of course not, that's silly, that's never going to happen. And now we unfortunately know we have to expect the unexpected, polio in the water, monkeypox, where the federal government is completely ill-equipped, as we saw, to deal with this. And there are issues on the city level as well, and there was just a hearing on that to improve the city's response. So what we as a city council can do, the city council has oversight over city agencies. So the Department of Health, Councilmember Shulman's committee, has oversight over the health committee. So she did just that. She had a hearing the other day on monkeypox, really saying, well, wait a minute, why did the city not take these certain actions? Why were these decisions made? That's where the city council really has a lot of control through oversight. That is where jurisdiction. We don't run and operate the agencies, that's the mayor's job. It's our job then to have oversight and to say, you know what, these issues were not handled correctly. This is where the city should have done, but they didn't do, and we have to have really strong oversight.
In relation to monkeypox specifically, we had a vaccine rollout with COVID-19. In theory, we should have known how to have a vaccine rollout for monkeypox, and it's frankly been terrible. I've had my first shot. I have no idea when I'm going to get my second shot. Can you highlight what you think the city has learned and implemented effectively in relation to dealing with pandemics and public health, and what we're still getting wrong that's causing these problems.
So it's a really important question. One of the things that I really felt Mayor de Blasio should have done, and I personally urged him to do it, and he, did not do it, is when I was running the census, we were dealing with communities that had traditionally not responded. They're called hard to count communities that did not want to respond to the census because either distrust of government or they weren't convinced it had any impact on their life. And it was our job to try to convince them, take the 10 minutes to fill this out, because this means literally thousands of dollars per person who fills the census out in terms of funds for affordable housing and education and all the things that the city needs. So and the work we did in the census, New York City came out #1 of every major city. So we really succeeded on the census. One of the things that helped us succeed is we gave grants to community organizations on the ground that were their trusted voice in their neighborhood. And we gave to some very non-traditional groups that had never received city funding. I'll give you an example. There was this one group called Sure We Can, which were canners. These canners who were canning in various communities, but they had built this infrastructure where people listened to them. They'd never received a city grant before. And we're like, we're gonna give money to them because the people are gonna listen to this group more than they're gonna listen to the city of New York and the city government. So we gave out almost half of our budget to organizations on the ground because we knew that they were the ones that were trusted, not us, not city government officials, and it really, really worked. And so I urged the mayor, and I wrote an op-ed about this at the time when COVID first came out, saying why not use the infrastructure that we built on the census for vaccine distribution? Because generally the same communities that were hesitant to get a vaccine were oftentimes exact same communities that were hesitant to fill out the census. And we had a whole model that works, but it wasn't used. And I think that was a real mistake.
I obviously couldn't agree more, but I'm going to fast forward the question a bit and say, how has the Adams administration been on the same issue?
On monkeypox or on COVID?
Oh, no, on what you were just talking about.
Oh.
When the suggestion that you made to de Blasio that was clearly not taken.
It wasn't
I imagine
taken.
that you've made the same suggestion to the current administration.
Yeah,
is it being received or is it still not?
I've made the same request to the Adams administration because again, we have the infrastructure there. They've told me that they are looking at it, but has not been adopted yet. And it's easily replicable because it's all there. It's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. These organizations are all there. We did a granting model where it's easy to get the money out the door to them because sometimes it can actually be incredibly difficult. As easy it might seem that you want to give money to a really good community organization, not that easy to do. The city has so many rules and restrictions, but we're able to do that. So I've made the request again. I hope that they will do it because again, I think whether it's monkeypox vaccination, whether it's something else that happens with COVID, whether it's some other health crisis that unfortunately we don't know about that could be looming, we need to be utilizing this kind of community infrastructure model.
And I think that's something that's really important, and some of you highlighted during your campaign a lot, which is that so many of the failures that we see in government aren't because we don't know how to solve a problem, it's because we're not utilizing the systems that already exist to solve those problems in communities. And the frustration that you expressed about the de Blasio administration makes a lot of sense. I'm sure the vast majority of New Yorkers will agree. And I certainly hope the current administration takes your advice. They'd probably see their approval rating go up. And when we look at especially at dealing with communities that have been, as you described, as hard to reach, that's something we talked about with Congressman Nadler and Maloney when I was here a few weeks ago, and he had suggested trusted community groups going, essentially even door to door and introducing, providing information. Are there any current efforts at all to reach marginalized communities and those who have had a tougher time with healthcare access, either due to internet, lack of trust in the community, et cetera, to start accessing health services?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, absolutely. And I know in talking to Councilmember Shulman, because again, she's got the oversight over the health committee, on monkeypox vaccination, like she's been talking to them about that, making sure that it's trusted voices. they did a number of sort of nights of outreach, going into the community, making sure. And she's been a big proponent of that because, again, it can't just be city government officials saying, you can't do this or you must do that, because we know those messages are oftentimes not heard. And so I know she's put that forward, and maybe you'll invite her to come and talk.
I would be absolutely delighted to have Councilmember Schulman come and talk to us. So before we close out for the day, I wanted you to give us some final thoughts about both your first year as it's gone so far and what you're hoping to see from the second year of your councilship.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Chris, and thank all of you for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, to ask questions. I love serving in the city council. It's been an honor of a lifetime. I'm only in my first year, but I have big, bold plans for what I want to accomplish in the council, legislatively, policy-wise, as an office, handling constituent issues. I mean, that's the one thing, we spent a lot of time talking about legislation, which I'm very passionate about. But the other thing I'm equally passionate about is constituent services, because at the end of the day, it's about, and people know this about me, I really am very responsive. If you email, if you text me, and I require the same of everyone in our office. I mean, people know this who work in our office. We are in, as I like to say, the customer service business. It's no different than if you go into a restaurant and if suddenly, you're ordering a hamburger or whatever, salad or whatever, and your food does not come on time. It's the same with government delivery service. Like, that's unacceptable. And so I really endeavor to try to solve problems rapid fire. It's not like we're going to be able to solve every single problem. Like the gentleman's issue in the back, we can't solve that in 24 hours, but I can guarantee you that first thing on Monday morning, I will be calling the DOT commissioner and raising that issue. And I will work doggedly to try to get it done as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. Everyone, let's give a round of applause to